Nostalgia rides a rocking chair, back and forth to long ago. Young at heart, but white of hair, nostalgia rides a rocking chair to find the dreams that still await where youth hung them on a June rainbow. Nostalgia rides a rocking chair, back and forth to long ago. Some time ago, a retired Clatskanie teacher left us this little quip of humor. Spring is here, and so am I. But at my age, I don't know why. If nature can be born anew, why can't I be recycled too? Clatskanie, 1882. This is probably one of the earliest pictures of this area. As the only means of travel was by water, there were no roads out of Clatskanie. The stern-wheeler Manzanillo can be seen before the white building. For many years, there was a warehouse to store produce going out and to accept goods brought in for the settlers. The foreground is the land now occupied by John Lillick's many storage buildings. Nehalem Street is in the background, and Hump's Restaurant would later be center across the river. Clatskanie, 1890. In 12 years' time, more buildings had sprung up along the Nehalem Street. Look closely and see the boats at the mooring along the Nehalem Street. The river is now spanned by a crude bridge. No school and no castle was evident at this time. A few homes were now in evidence on the Evenson Hill. In the distance, what appears to be a road is actually a flume, a V-shaped trough which extended far in the flume, and the lumber was floated to a finishing mill. This mill was in the vicinity of the swimming pool. Probably the first bridge across the Clatskanie River on Nehalem Street. Clatskanie is growing. More building means more settlers. Since all the land adjacent to the river was subject to flooding and quite marshy, the road, Nehalem Street, was elevated and planked as far as the higher ground. This could be between 1900 and 1905. The castle was completed in the late 1890s or early 1900s. The school on the site of the middle school building is in evidence. Look closely for the stern-wheeler. Benson's logging operation is also noticeable in the foreground. As far back as I can remember, this was the Karasti home. It is still very well preserved. The road led to the depot and later became a part of early Highway 30. Since there were many pedestrians, walking was made easier by these sidewalks. Nehalem Street has become a busy place. Every effort was made to make it usable. Note the house at the end of the street built by Amos Benson and later occupied by the Evenson families. There was much mud in the roads and streets. Overshoes were a must in order to protect the shoes and households. These protectors were made of rubber and covered the lower part of the shoe. It was not uncommon to lose this protective covering when the mud was particularly deep. The Grand Central Hotel, situated in the vicinity of the present Conestoga, this three-storied building had a dining room where meals were served to travelers and locals. The Koberstein Building, located approximately at the corner of Nehalem Street and Lillick Street. It was the home, that is upstairs, of the Koberstein family. Mr. Koberstein, who had been employed by Weinhardt, a beer maker in Portland, was offered the opportunity of having a saloon in Clatskanie if he would sell the manufacturer's beer. Mr. Koberstein accepted this very favorable proposition and moved his family to Clatskanie when everything was in order. However, after a few years, he knew this was not the life work for him and gave up the saloon business. The family continued to live upstairs for many years. When this picture was taken, the lower part was labeled the Astoria Cafe. Looking up Nehalem Street, the Koberstein building is still the Astoria Cafe, but the photography shop has become the home of the Clatskanie chief. To the right is a blacksmith shop to accommodate the needs of wagons and horses. Mr. Hughes stands ready to sell harnesses or whatever horse and buggy travelers might need. When the automobile came into being, Mr. Hughes changed his trade to meet the more modern needs. Storefronts were a great place to gather to learn the latest news and pass the time of day. That Mr. Knackley sold hats is quite evident, but many and varied were goods sold in the general stores. A dim view of Nehalem Street before 1918. All the stores have false fronts to make them appear more impressive. We are at the foot of the hill where Nehalem Street moves up to the churches. This entire area now comprises Highway 30 and Hump's Restaurant and parking lot. The Imperial Hotel provided lodging and food for travelers and traveling salesmen. The middle building was Mr. Hall's drugstore, and upstairs were the offices of the dentist, Dr. Zipper, and the medical doctor, Dr. J.L. Wooden. Note the weeping willow tree trying to survive. Nehalem Street, looking up to the churches. The street and sidewalks show considerable improvement. Perhaps it was not the rainy season. The Meyer building to the left and the post office to the right. Repair to a building is cluttering part of the street. Not many settlers could be as leisurely as the man at the right. What do you suppose those two are discussing? We are very close to the 1920s. The willow tree has reached its mature beauty. One 4th of July, there were concessions in that area. A spin of the wheel might get you a choice prize or nothing. A dime was a lot of money, and to get nothing, a near tragedy. A better look at the drugstore. In the far left is the dentist, Dr. Zipper. Next is our beloved country doctor, Dr. Wooden. Before his store stands Arthur Hall and a friend. The upstairs served as dentist and doctor offices. To the extreme right appears a sidewalk which led to the waterfront. Some shops, the movie house, and Charlie Conyers' music store faced the river. One finally emergence to open ground across from the Kratz home, now the Windermere St. Helens Realty. Dr. Zipper and Dr. Wooden putting on an act for the camera. Mr. Hall and his employee, Mabel Patterson. Dr. Wooden and Mr. Hall were influential in getting telephone service out into the country and to the logging camps. They purchased the telephone company in 1907 for $800. Originally, the switch box, I should say, was in the rear of the drugstore. Mabel Popham Patterson was the first operator, combining these duties with clerking in the drugstore for 4 years, from her senior year in high school until her marriage to Patterson in 1911. Service was expanded to various camps tied with the Nehalem Mutual at Mist and became the switching station connecting Mager area to Portland and Astoria. An inside glimpse of Arthur Hall's drugstore, which he purchased from his cousin Dr. Hall, who practiced medicine there in the early days. Dr. Zipper dropped in for a Christmas season chat with Mr. Hall. Did he leave the tracts on the floor? In the doorway of the drugstore stand Dr. Wooden and the 2 telephone operators. Outside stands Mr. Hall and his son Knowlton, later a professor in Augusta, Georgia. The daughter Elizabeth contracted an illness when she was in the 8th grade, which left her blind. Here is where Highway 30 turned right on Nehalem Street and led on as the present Highway 30. Note the new home of the chief office. All this area is now occupied by Highway 30 at the light and Hump's Restaurant and parking lot. The women are members of a pioneer family. Millicent and Asley, daughters of Enoch Conyers, and Nora, daughter of Will Conyers. The Myers building was a general merchandise store of 1900, owned by Mr. Myers and later by Viola Shepherd. Among the little girls is Irene Graham, and the boy is William Hempel. Abe Myers in the center is the owner. Elsie Markwell Shepherd in her dry goods store. In addition to practical things, one could find beadwork, laces, fancy hats, decorative handled umbrellas, and perfumes. Ione Markwell Sundberg sits in the aisle. The Clatskanie River as viewed from the area of the present-day swimming pool. Henry Kratz's general store on Nehalem Street. Mr. Kratz stands in the doorway, as does a relative of Morris Lillick. Margaret Fisk and Madge Hyatt Bunce seem to be enjoying a snack from the store. The date, 1895 or 1896. H. McKeel was an Armenian who became a thriving merchant in Clatskanie. However, his many family problems drained away the profits. Tragedy stalked him all his life, it seemed. Finally, he remained alone in his advanced years, eking out an existence as best he could. Honor Tempest's grandfather is to the left and Mr. McKeel to the right of the doorway. Simmons and Dugan's General Merchandise Store was another early-day business establishment. The lean-to at the left items catering to the fishermen and farmers. This building later became the Anderson Furniture Store, and Mr. Anderson was also the mortician. The lean-to became the mortuary and was still in existence in 1941. Mr. McKeel and his family outside his store. Progress is evident in the numerous buildings. The area remains rural. Note the castle, schools, churches, and elevated Nehalem Street in the foreground. The new bridge is in place and in use. Without the sophisticated equipment of today, it is puzzling how this was accomplished. The house in the foreground is known as the Hazen Home and has been known by Elliott, Blackford, and other names. The churches, Methodist and Presbyterian, prominent, so this is after 1905. Clatskanie has expanded in every direction. Taken from the Evenson Hill, this gives an opposite view of expanding Clatskanie. The building center front is known as the Benson Depot. Amos Benson and his logging operations came to Clatskanie in 1903. His logging railroad passed on the Clatskanie side of the building to the boom where the logs were unloaded into the water. The building was a storage place for necessary supplies. Another and similar view of Clatskanie from the middle school, then the only school. Nehalem Street with an array of cars, a rare occurrence in Clatskanie. EB service station located adjacent to the shopping area where the post office was located. The spire of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is barely visible of the car. Then the Baptist Church. At this time, the parking lot and shopping area were a swamp reaching to the Clatskanie River. A fire engine of the 1930s. The castle as it was for many years. Nehalem Street. The White House was built by Dr. Hall for his family. Later it became the Titchener House. It was eventually moved to Highway 30 across from the Shell Station. The building to the lower left became known as the Conyers Building, where, in addition to dry goods, school textbooks were sold. All of the necessary books were slow in arriving. School opened, and sometimes we waited 3 weeks for books to arrive. Personalities, schools, and churches. Dr. Joseph E. Hall was our early doctor, coming here in 1888 with his wife Fanny and sons Alan E. and Charles C. He was a Civil War veteran who practiced medicine in Pennsylvania and San Diego, California. In 1905, he turned over his practice to Dr. Frank W. Wood and moved to Portland, though he returned to serve this area when needed. He also owned the Clatskanie Drug Company when he sold it in 1904. W. Arthur Hall acquired it in 1905. The property remained in the Hall family until sometime in the 1940s. Dr. Joseph E. Hall, his wife Fanny, and boys Charles and Alan in the home he built for his family. This same house was moved from Nehalem Street in locale of the City Hall to the corner of Highway 30 and Conyers Street across from the Shell service station. The Enoch Conyers home on Nehalem Street across from the Zimmer home. The first Conyers home was a primitive dwelling on Bellflower Avenue. This house, though no longer in existence, had much history across its threshold. It was probably one of the earliest dwellings on Nehalem Street, 1866. Enoch was very civil-minded. He had the first school upstairs in this house. He did much to improve roads, especially to Mist and Birkenfield, or the Nehalem Valley as it was called. He was the only doctor in the early days. Old-timers say he went from house to house during the diphtheria epidemic that swept through Clatskanie, spreading more illness than he cured. It was he who offered to carry the mail from Oak Point to Clatskanie free for 2 years for the privilege of naming Clatskanie instead of Bryantville, as Elihu Bryant had dictated. His wife was Hannah Bryant. Enoch Conyers' son Charlie and a cousin from the east. This wilderness area, according to Charlie, was in the area of the Richfield station. Note the powder horn, long guns, and 3 hunting dogs. Charlie Conyers was responsible for this grocery store. Compare our supermarkets with this. Bananas remain on the stem. Nothing was prepackaged as today. Bins of dry goods were measured into brown bags. Cracker barrels, pickle barrels, peanut butter, containers sold bulk foods. Cheese was sliced from a huge round wheel of cheese. No refrigerator as we know it today. Floors were oiled to keep the dust down, and there was an aroma permeating the store, rarely found today. Charlie Conyers tried his hand at many trades. This was his music store on the riverfront. The old-time phonographs were made to play tubular records. They were probably not as melodious as they might have been, but we thoroughly enjoyed comedy and melody. Titchener and Charles Conyers, cousins, were often offering apples at a good price for those days. A mighty hunter was Will Conyers. His home was next to Nolte's on Nehalem Street and directly across from the middle school, which in the early history of Clatskanie was the one and only school. Will had his barn and cows on Bellflower Street across from Ray Jalma's. He went to milk his cows about the time school was dismissed for the day. The children who were going his way eagerly awaited the tales of his hunting adventures and begged for more. Enoch Conyers vacationed each summer. Where? On Conyers Creek, of course. To the right can be seen Enoch and his wife Hannah Bryant Conyers. As one may note, hats were worn even when out of doors along Conyers Creek. Mr. and Mrs. Titchener, Nancy Ann Conyers, on or about their wedding day. They had children, and their home was a showplace near Hidden Valley. Herb Clifford raised that place to build a new, modern home. Mr. and Mrs. Wood, for whom Woodson was named. She was a Murray of the family whose farm was in the locale of the Murray Hill Cemetery. Dr. Wooden bought the practice of Dr. Frank Wood in 1907 and married Mary Etta Rawlings. Dr. and Mrs. J.L. Wooden worked together for the health of farmers, loggers, and pioneers. On completion of his internship, they came to Clatskanie and served the community for over 50 years until his death. On Dr. Wooden Day, many a person could be claimed to be a wooden baby. Being the only doctor in the area, he served Kesey, Jewell, Buxton, Westport, and one in Mager, Quincy, Delena, and across the river to Hanson's Landing and Eagle Cliff. In 1918, he was a medical officer in World War I. Dr. Melvin Evans came to Clatskanie to take his place in 1923. Dapper Raymond Jones of the Hazel Grove area chose this means of getting to town. His family occupied the home where Ruts live on Olson Road. W.H. Conyers, half-brother to Enoch, settled along Conyers Creek on the Clatskanie Heights Road. He built the house presently occupied by the Harry Abetas. He studied law and became an attorney. His son George became a Clatskanie businessman, active in all civic affairs. His son, Jim of Sonoma, California, and Bob of St. Louis, Missouri, returned to Clatskanie for class reunions and keep in touch with old-timers. Bob Conyers contributed to the gazebo that is in the Clatskanie Park. Mrs. Haynes's Bakery on Nehalem Street in the vicinity of the Century Store. The girl in the middle is Marie Sweeney, daughter of Mrs. Haynes. The interior of the bakery. It was small, but Mrs. Haynes' products were prized by one and all. After 1918 and the completion of Highway 30, people from Portland, on their way to the beach, called in orders which they picked up as they drove through Clatskanie. Another order would be ready as they returned to Portland. In addition, she had a window full of penny candies, and what a joy to have a few cents to spend there. A birthday party organized by Nehalem, Titchener, and Bryant Street women for children born that year. Marie Sweeney is at the far right. She holds her daughter Kathleen, now living in Eugene, Oregon. Third from the right is George Sutherland, who lived in Tye Valley, Oregon. Third from the left is Mary Hall, who lived in Seattle. The elephant tree, so named by members of the Harding family who lived for years on the farm later owned by John Devine's parents, Janelle Poole. Beef on the hoof, Granddaddy Clark and Bill Ward. The latter was employed by our local butcher, Jess Lewis. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Whitten. She was the daughter of Titchener, and he a teacher who was instrumental in establishing the high school in Clatskanie. Dolly Rice Bridleson and Asley Conyers on the path leading to the Enoch Conyers home. The Zimmer home in the center front has had many occupants over the years. To the right is the home of Will Conyers. In 1940, this house was torn down to make way for a modern home. The newel post on the stairway was saved and served as support of the breakfast table. Ben Jalma occupied this home in later years. The old gym to the left is now only a memory for those who are old-timers. 4 members of the Popham family, whose home was in the locale of the police department. From the left, Nellie Popham McGilvery, Leona Popham Simmons, Jenny Popham Clark, and Mabel Popham Patterson. Each of these women have been involved in establishment and maintenance of our library. They donated their home as a building site for a new library which eventually became a reality. A typical early day schoolhouse, this one being the first school in the community of Sweettown. This school was the result of the efforts of Mr. Blood, E.S. Bryant, and E.W. Conyers. They paid for all the materials. It was a 6-by-20 box house with handmade desks and heated by a large box stove, all completed in 1869. In 1881, another school was built on a block of land willed to the district by Elihu Bryant upon his death. The same school situated where the middle school now stands. Arthur Hall taught school for 2 years. His nephews, or cousin's sons, occupied the simple benches. Note the blackboard. It is quite evident why it was so named. 2 teachers in the pre-1910 era, Anne English and Bertha Clark Barr. An early graduating class. From the left, Florence Williams, Eleanor Larson Walkie, and Dolly Rice Bridleson. The grade school, the gym, and the high school. About 1895 or later, Fred Whitten became the principal of the school. He, more than anyone else, was instrumental in establishing a high school. There were 17 students the first year in the high school, 16 girls and 1 boy, Orville Merrill. Lunchtime and playtime at school. Another view of Clatskanie Grade School. The paper published by the students in the high school. The names Bryant, Merrill, and Conyers figure prominently in civic affairs. The Clatskanie Grade School, as it was in 1928, and where many old-timers received their education. A view of Clatskanie from the Titchener Hill. The building right, which was the high school, became the 7th and 8th grades after the addition was made to the Clatskanie Grade School. Taken before 1910, this was the entire enrollment. Bertha Barr stands at the extreme left. The class of the late 1918, Bertha Lewison Fogel is the teacher. Probably a 6th grade class. Old-timers would recognize and name many of these students. Early 1920s. Another Bertha Lewison Fogel class. The Methodist Church was the only church until this, the Presbyterian Church, was completed in 1905. Looking down Nehalem Street with a view of a flat street and 2 churches. You would never guess that this gully ever existed. Pedestrians were provided for, but no horse and buggy travel on this street until the pick and shovel and horse crews filled the abyss. It is said that everything conceivable was used in addition to rocks and earth to make the street level. Reverend and Mrs. James Fawcett, longtime highly respected Presbyterian minister and parents of Mrs. Clarence Evenson. Farming and the Dyke lands. Farming in the 1800s and early 1900s required hours and hours of work and many days compared to present methods. Horses were the power used to move machinery. Here, Adam Barr mows the hayfield in preparation for the winter feed for his cattle. To dry the hay, it was raked and formed into mounds. Each mound a hay fork full when loading it on the wagon to transport to the barn. This is Mr. Titchener with his binder, which shaped sheaves of grain. These were put into stacks to dry in the field. Mr. John Palm and son Adolph went from farm to farm with his threshing machine to produce the oat grain from the sheaves. The wagon in the foreground has brought grain from the field and is feeding the thresher. The grain poured into sacks while the chaff became a huge mound in the background. A Titchener is gazing at us from the lower right. A grist mill on the farm of Will and Jimmy Barr, who lived in the Hazel Grove area. Farmers came from as far as in the Halem Valley to have their grain ground into flour. A view of Clatskanie from the Magruder Hill. Much of the land along the Columbia was a huge swamp. Mr. Magruder is here, contemplating a way to create useful farmland of this. He organized a development committee to provide the money for the dredging and diking. The first support came from San Francisco businessmen in 1906, but the earthquake of that year eliminated that source of financing. The dredge, Muscat, and Skookum dug drainage ditches and built dikes. More dikes and ditches to produce farmland. The dikes became the roads throughout the dike land. The ditches drained the land to produce land for good crops. An early view of the salvaged land. This land was named Little Holland because it resembled reclamation projects in Holland. A group of men who were local supporters of Mr. Magruder's venture. Mr. Magruder was slight of stature. He stands alone in the second row, appearing to be a boy in a Boy Scout uniform. A fine crop of potatoes gives proof of the fertility of the dike lands. The hayfield on the dike land. A Columbia County Fair display boasts a variety of vegetables and grains grown on Mr. Magruder's dreamlands, here known as the Columbia Delta Farms and Gardens. Mr. Magruder's barn and fine herd of cattle imported from the Guernsey Islands. A bird's eye view of Mr. Magruder's dream. His home was a landmark atop this hill from which the picture was taken. The barn, lower center, still stands as a reminder of the glory days of the dike lands. The transportation and travel. The only means of getting to Clatskanie was by water. The stern wheelers that rode high on the water came into Clatskanie regularly with freight for farmers and to pick up produce in exchange. This was the Manzanillo, 1883, docked at the warehouse on the waterfront. If by chance a traveler living in the Nehalem Valley came by boat from Portland, he could engage this type of stage to take him over the mountain into Mist, Birkenfield, or wherever his home might be. Everything depended on horsepower to be moved. The greater the load, the more the horses. Johnny Johnson seems to at ease with his task. In 1898, when the railroad came to Clatskanie, there had to be taxi service from the depot to the city center. Johnny Johnson provided shelter from the rain with his taxi service. Squeaky Johnson needed 3 horses to haul a load of shingles. Note the puncheon rode rough travel, but better than mud. Squeaky Johnson had a high-pitched voice, according to Bill Woods. Johnny Johnson has brought the wares of a traveling salesman in those trunks. He uses the Imperial Hotel as his headquarters. Local merchants would come to him to replenish their merchandise. This is the Popham blacksmith shop on Nehalem Street across from the Presbyterian Church. The interior of one of the blacksmith shops. This blacksmith shop is also on Nehalem Street, but across from the library. Another view of a blacksmith shop with many omens of good luck. the horseshoes. The stern-wheeler Beaver made weekly trips into Clatskanie, alerting everyone as it came. Not only did the Beaver haul produce, on occasion it was engaged by churches to provide an outing for the entire congregation. This scene is approximately in the area of the lawyer's office. Elsie Markwell converses with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Hughes, before venturing on an outing. A Sunday outing. One buggy serves Benny. Jenny Clocks faces the camera. Mr. Cliff Orwick, local meat market operator, next to the rear wheel. Bertha Barr Clark on the Hazel Grove Bridge. Many ladies depended on this means of travel. Until 1909, after the railroad came toward Astoria, this was the means of moving the train to the Washington side of the Columbia. The Clatskanie Depot built in 1898 when the railroad was completed to Astoria. A view of the now non-existent depot. Mr. Chris Johnson and his postal truck, which brought the sacks of mail to the post office and transported train passengers to Clatskanie. Mrs. Grace Magruder and son Kent can be seen near the doorway. Building Highway 30 at Rocky Point, a pick and shovel job. Supplies needed by the road crews were brought by scows and stern wheelers. Grant Jones of Hazel Grove with his crew on Highway 30. Rock and tar were brought by the river. Bugby loops before completion. Improvements in the highway has eliminated this tiresome travel from Wanna to the Bradwood Park at the top of the hill. An early auto owned by Dr. Wooden in 1911. He retained the horse and buggy that came with his practice to facilitate travel on country roads. In 1918, Highway 30 was completed from Portland to Astoria. A celebration in Clatskanie brought an influx of cars from Astoria. Dr. Wooden's Hupmobile and Elizabeth and Knowlton Hall, children of Mr. Arthur Hall. Completion of the highway from Portland to Astoria in 1918 brought more cars to Clatskanie than this town had ever seen here. The occasion prompted a joyful celebration. Fleur Shingle Mill in Maker, which contributed to the economy of the area in the early 1900s. A snow scene from the G.P. Erickson Hill taken before 1920. Difficult to discern, the Maplewood Cemetery holds the center of the picture. Logging skid roads to railroads. The Grant Jones timber claim. Many claims were purchased by Amos Benson for a fair price. The early pioneers used oxen to move their logs to the sawmills. A logging operation in Marshland. The logs laid across the road were greased with oil to make the oxen's load move more smoothly. The skid road was used for advantageous, another means of getting logs closer to the mill. Mr. Shortledge and his daughter Mary posed for this picture in their busy day. The man on his haunches to the rear is the grease monkey. The pail beside him contains oil which he smears on the cross logs before the oxen arrive with their load. He must constantly work ahead of the teams and crew. Industry largely responsible for Clatskanie's growth have been concerned with logging. Pioneers involved in this growth were T.J. Flippen, Eli Bryant and family, W.K. Titchener, Henry Colvin, W.E. Conyers, and others. According to the old-timers, this was a Bryant mill, vaguely in the vicinity of the Clatskanie Bridge on Highway 30. Another view of the Bryant mill. Greater activity noted in this picture of the Bryant mill. The small bridge seems to span a part of the river that floats the logs to be moved to the mill. This interesting picture is taken from the Evenson Hill looking down into the area of the swimming pool. The trestle supporting the flume of the V-shaped trough end at the finishing mill here. The flume extended miles into the hills where a mill sawed the logs into rough lumber. A dam maintained an ample supply of water. When it was time to move the rough lumber, water was released to move the lumber to the finishing mill. Then the dam was closed to ensure adequate water for the next supply of rough lumber. This mill in the park area was known as Kingsley's Mill for many years, but later owned and operated by Clayton Walkie. Beaver Falls, a flume, and the mill taken in 1914. No evidence of logging in that area remains except occasional tree stumps. The Keystone Mill, located above Swedetown Road, above and behind Mr. Fisher's home and to the right of the Mackala home. Employees of the Keystone Mill, George Conyers in the direct center with the suspender visible. Under the chain and the hook is a Fogle relative. Near the swimming pool in the Clatskanie Park, the river appears larger than today. Trees were immense in the virgin timber of the late 1800s and early 1900s, as exemplified by these men with their outstretched arms. This is an excerpt from a writing by Wayne Curdy. The fallers had a dangerous job. First they inserted a board into the tree, which became the platform on which they worked. Then they made the undercut with their axes, the direction in which the tree should fall. The crosscut saw was used to saw through the rest of the tree. Each man held a handle found at each end of the saw, and together they felled the forest giants. The steam donkey, used for many heavy tasks, was used by Benson and then by Benson and Evenson. Evenson brought an engine and a mile of track, which he sent to Oak Point, Washington area, near what is now Stella. This facilitated the logging business to such an extent that miles of track and engines were used in the early 1900s wherever Evenson and Benson logged. They joined forces in Clatskanie in 1906 to 1913 when Evenson bought out Benson. The railroad passed through Clatskanie daily on its way to the boom where the logs were dumped into the Clatskanie slough to become cigar rafts. The logs keep the train intact. Taken in 1911 across the road from the William Barr home, the trestle led to logging operations across the Clatskanie River in the Hazel Grove area. The trains dumping logs into the Clatskanie River and the flume built high, carrying its load to the finishing mill, upper center and right, picture north of Clatskanie. The huge logs are a thing of the past. Back view of Clatskanie from the river. All businesses face Nehalem Street and the river. The man in the boat is just below what is now Hump's Restaurant. Rafting logs at Clatskanie by Benson. The unloading area for Benson Timber Company logs. Rafting the logs to move them to Wallace Slough on the Columbia to become part of the cigar raft. 1 or 2 families lived here and worked here. The oil tank which kept the trains and the camp supplied with oil. In order to move the logs to Wallace Slough, these men shaped and secured the logs so they could be moved by huge loads propelled by towboats. The men wore spiked shoes to keep them on the logs. They used pike poles to maneuver the logs into the desired position. The tugboat and logs ready for the cradle. In 1906, Simon Benson and O.J. Evenson entered the rafting business in Wallace Slough. Mr. Fastaben and Mr. Evenson improved on the cradle and the towing gear. Logs were maneuvered into this form, firmly chained, and when completed, one side permitted the raft to float free. A completed raft ready to float free. A completed raft ready for an ocean voyage to the Benson Mill in San Diego. The first cigar raft was small by comparison with the later ones. Mr. Evenson accompanied the tug towing this raft to watch its action in the sea. This resulted in several improvements. All arrived safely in San Diego. Taken at Stella, Washington in 1896. The cradle on the right assembled this 65-foot wide, 35-foot deep, and 100-foot long raft. The log cigar contained 5 million feet of lumber. Note the chains used to hold the logs in place. a raft and the tugboats heading for Astoria, and a sea voyage to San Diego, California. Nehalem Street built up from the swamplands. The house at the right was built by Amos Benson, son of Simon, later occupied by the Evensons. The building's lower left was a warehouse commonly known as the Benson Depot. The Benson train passed directly in front of the Benson house on its way to the unloading area. On Saturday evenings, it brought visitors to Clatskanie and the surrounding area. Every Sunday at 8 p.m., it whistled an "all aboard" warning to these people returning to camp. The walk was long and dangerous. No one wanted to miss the train. Logging operations at the Cary Logging Company of Cary, Oregon, just this side of Westport. The Westport Slough, where employees lived in houseboats, mooring their tugboats close by. Louis of Mager, belonging to Grannis John Erickson. Here it is used as a vacation excursion for family and friends, taken in the Westport Slough. Town events. Even back in the horse and buggy days, the 4th of July was an occasion for celebrations and parades. Look down Nehalem Street. The parade of the vehicles comes up Main Street. Only a few flags indicate the occasion. Another 4th of July, where the entire fire department took part. Flags and patriotic bunting were used generously. About 1914 or 15, this float, with the Queen and her attendants, was the main attraction. On the street between the Presbyterian Church and the present police department, the building behind the float was the livery stable that provided horse and buggy service. The early fire station was located in the vicinity of the Masonic Hall. Volunteers of the fire department preparing to become part of the parade. Some group on Nehalem Street across from the Methodist Church. Mr. Chandler was to be Grand Marshal, ready and waiting. The parade in good order. The Queen and her court take precedence over Mr. Chandler and lead the parade. The local band sets the pace and announces the parade is on its way. Local women, PEOs, enter the spirit of the day and fill Mrs. Magruder's car to the brimming. Kent Magruder is the little boy stuffed into the back seat. Dr. and Mrs. Wooden also came out in full array. Mrs. Clarence Evenson, Ruth, and her mother, Mrs. Fawcett, can be seen in the back seat. June was the month of the Rose Show, an annual event for a time. Mrs. Haynes of the wonderful bakery loved roses, and she and the Presbyterian Ladies' Aid added a public dinner to this event, which brought money to aid church expenses. The show was held on the second floor of the Graham Building and the dinner downstairs. The audience sees this: roses, participants, and possible awards of the winners. Mr. Blackford left was a great organizer of public activity. Here he has 12 local belles costumed and trained for the broom dance. Another venture was the cornet band trained to perform in civic events. Ladies of the Maccabees, Wallula Beehive, number 32. Old-timers would recognize local matron. April 1917, a day when many Clatskanie's young men went enthusiastically off to fight for their country. The entire town cheered them to the train depot. Cars of that era, part of the parade. At the train depot, patriotism ran high. The old roads became a mud wall when it rained. The depot, right top, with Chris Johnson's jitney bus that brought mail and passengers to town. The celebration of the completion of Highway 30 from Portland to Astoria. Fishing. Some buildings opened to both Nehalem Street and the riverfront. Gillnet boats in the Clatskanie River with wares and to buy supplies. Seining was one of the means to catch fish. The following pictures explain the procedure, though on a larger scale than was found at Wallace Island. These pictures were taken at Sand Island in the Columbia near Astoria. The sheds are shelter for horses and men when the tide is high. Horses used to pull in the nets loaded with fish. The men preparing to lay out the nets far out in the river. Horses in readiness. Boats haul out the nets. One end remains near the shore to be attached to the hauling device pulled by horses. Looking back at the horses and sand island. Low time and time for rest. The men and horses in knee-deep water with one end of the 22 net. Notice the floats close by. The catch was huge and abundant, a seed in the Eagle Cliff Cannery in Washington. Canned products ready for packaging and shipping. The Eagle Cliff Cannery, an important part of Columbia River economy, is now only history.
Clatskanie's most notable historian and narrator of this presentation, Mrs. Melvina Barr. The daughter of Swedish immigrants, Melvina Eriksson Barr was born in Clatskanie in 1910 and has lived all of her life in the community. Her husband of 63 years was William Bill Barr, the descendant of one of Clatskanie's first pioneer families. A teacher at Clatskanie Elementary School for over 25 years, Mrs. Barr began collecting historic photographs and recording the history of Clatskanie while helping her daughters, Greta Barr Pierce and Alberta Bertie Barr Smith, with local history projects in the 1950s. Several years later, she developed a slideshow on Clatskanie history with the help of a fellow teacher, Aili Renica Asiala. Mrs. Barr's research on the topic of local history has continued for decades as she's compiled over 250 photographs of old Clatskanie with an entertaining narrative about them, including stories and insights into the colorful personalities of the community's pioneers. She has become locally famous for her history presentations to school classes, churches, and civic organizations. At the age of 92, Mrs. Barr served as Grand Marshal of the 2003 Clatskanie Heritage Days celebration, pioneering in Clatskanie.